And welcome to my UK jazz inspired generative chords and drums Max MSP patch for my third year module at the University of Leeds. So I'll just show you the presentation mode quickly. So this is what it will look like to an end user, which could be any kind of musician or producer who's looking for inspiration, wants to improvise over. And there's two elements to it, which is the keys or any polyphonic plugin that you want to use, software instrument, you can output it to that. So this is this has been inspired by two artists, Alfa and Kamal Williams. So each time you select an artist profile, it will use the harmonic language based on first order Markov chains, and the result is something that sounds somewhat like these artists, Alfa and Kamal Williams, who are on that UK jazz scene. So there's the keys element, and then there's a drum element here, as you can see in the beat grid. This is a very much simplified version of the patch, and I'll come back to this at the end when I do my demonstration. But beforehand, I'll just explain everything that's going on behind the patch. So it's quite clearly labeled. We've got the sound generation and MIDI out here. This just prepares all the kind of MIDI notes that are going to be going into the plugins. So the plugins I use are Lounge Lizard, Analog Lab, and Diva, and you can control these however you want. You know, you've got volume controls, pan controls, and you can kind of click on each plugin here. It should come up with a window if you give it a second. Yeah, and then we can kind of select any kind of sound. So this is Analog Lab 4. We can go for like a synth sound inspired by the DX7, CS80, Prophet 5. There's loads of synths you can choose. So I've got kind of a varied sound output. I've got Lounge Lizard here, which is based on Rhodes and Wurlitzer, and the Diva, which is again a sort of analog synth inspired software instrument. So those are just for the outs, for the MIDI out. And if I come back to here, so all the MIDI notes are being defined by artist profiles, which we have over here. So that's to say Alfa and Kamal Williams. So I've done a lot of first order. I've done a lot of chordal harmonic analysis of Alfa and Kamal Williams' discography, and I put that into a state transition matrix to be read by Max. So if we go to the sub patcher for Alfa, we can see that. This is for the Markov chain. So we get the sub patcher here. And all these messages are effectively showing us a state transition matrix to be read by the ml.markov object from the ml.star set max package objects by, I think it was Benjamin Day Smith or someone like that. I'm sorry if I got the name wrong. So this is the Markov. Sorry, this is the state transition matrix to be read by the Markov object. And obviously that whole state matrix has been informed by previous research, harmonic research of Alfa songs. And that will get put into a sub patcher for the chords. So it takes a number, so in the Markov chain. So these are all the state numbers. So 0 would be chord 1, 1 would be chord 2, 2 would be a flat 3 chord, etc. And the Markov object will take all this data and output a final integer here. So it could be 3, 4, anything from 0 to 8 here. And that corresponds to these chords. So then if we go back onto the chords subpatcher, we take that integer, so it could be chord 3, and that will be E major 7 sharp 11, I think. Well, I think I've since changed that. My apologies. It's now an E7 sus4 chord, and so this col object has all the MIDI notes, which will be banged by the Markov architecture there. So if the Markov decides that it will output an integer 4, then it will be an F sus4 chord, which I've then translated into MIDI notes here, and there's 6 notes per chord, which is just a preference thing that I've worked out. And then we've got other aspects of the sort of, I don't know, chordal data. So we've got a voicing generator here, and that just uses a list and uses the ladd object from the L-Objects max package, and that will add either an octave or subtract an octave from one of the notes in the chord, which will give us a certain inversion for that chord, and then a different voicing on the whole. And that will just change things up. And much like in a live performance, you'll often have artists that change voicings every time. So you kind of want that in something generative. You don't want to keep the same voicings over each time that a chord is played. And then on that same note of keeping things different, we've got a chord time delay, and that's just a really subtle time delay to each individual note within a chord. So, for example, when you have an artist playing a chord, they're not going to be playing necessarily the chord at exactly the same time every time. Sorry, they're not going to be playing a note at the exact same time. So it just sort of delays each note by a few milliseconds just to sort of get a human feel into it. Which I think works quite nicely, especially if you have the last note kind of like rolling off. It's a really nice effect to have. So these drunk objects just help us to make that kind of ripple effect, or not. It just depends on what the what you're going for at the time. Also got a velocity changer in a similar vein. When performers are playing chords, they're not likely to play every note with the exact same velocity. So we just, again, use that drunk object to slightly alter the velocity of each individual note within a chord. We'll come back onto the duration a bit later. And effectively here, what this is doing, the global root is, if we go to here, say someone wants to pick a root, it could be C, E, A, that will then take the MIDI notes from the chord col here. As you can see, it's 0, which would be a very low note, the 0 octave, and it will just add that whole list here to the global root so that you get the chord in the right octave. Effectively, then we can then have octave transposing, which just pluses or minuses 12 or 24, depending on what octave you want to be operating within. Obviously, that will change as the voicings change, as I said earlier. So the same process goes on for Kamal Williams. We have a different state transition matrix here. Because of the harmonic language that Kamal Williams uses, there's a lot more states here, as he uses a lot of parallel harmonies. So there's not a lot of conventional harmony. As you can see, we've got sharp 7 chords, flat 4, flat 2 chords. It just depends on the context with which Kamal Williams uses it. And again, same thing for the chord patch, chord time delay, velocity changer, etc. And we've got a col with completely different chords, and these are all the chords here. So the 11ths, his use of minor 9s, for example, that's all based off of the chords that Kamal Williams tends to use in his discography, which I've done research on and I've got a spreadsheet for, and that's all based on the harmonic analysis there. Also, you'll see I've used up to 8 notes per chord for Kamal Williams, just to sort of flesh out the harmonies there. So if we come to the timekeeping and oh, hang on, sorry, my bad. I've just skipped over the part I wanted to go to. So we've got the chord rhythm selector, which again, this is a generative element which outputs chords at certain points in time given this step sequencer. So we've got a step sequencer which has up to 32 steps, and then that is being fed into the cell object, and then depending on what these integers here say, that's what will give us the rhythms to select a chord. So for example, I use a table object to say that there is 100% chance that on the first step of the 32 steps, a chord will be banged. So this 32-step sequencer gives us a 4-bar sequence. So for the first step in these 4 bars, for every 4 bars, there's definitely going to be a chord that's banged. And then the rest of the tables have different probabilities, which I have preset as to what step, as to when a chord will be banged. So we got 1, 8, 17, 24, and they all correspond to a step within this 32-step sequence that chord will be banged at. And then that brings us on to the duration. So here I've got sort of expression which works out the difference between, say, the 8th step and the first step, and that's how long that the chord will be held for. So if we look at, so for example, there's 300 milliseconds in an 8th note at 100 BPM. So that's 300 milliseconds in an 8th note at 100 BPM. So I take that, and to avoid any overlap, I have it at 270 milliseconds, and that will take this step multiplier, which I call it here, so 8, 8, 13, and 6, times that by 270, and that will give us the overall duration for the chord there. And I've got some other architecture here, which just tells you whether or not a chord is even going to be banged. So obviously we've got 4 chords per 4-bar sequence, but not at all time. So there's 4 chords per 4-bar sequence, but there is a chance that there's a minimum of 2 chords and a max of 4 chords being played in any one given 4-bar sequence. And this architecture here just decides that. I've got the comments there to show you what's going on there. So if you come to the timekeeping and transport, this is what keeps the whole patch together. We've got the BPM there, and the transport objects, which are just used to communicate with other parts of the patch. The subdivisions architecture I'm not using anymore, but it's sort of a way to move forward in the future if I want to add subdivisions and sort of change the feel of a whole piece. So for example, with triplets, here I've got a bit of a swing adjust, so if you want to change the whole feel of the piece, you can add some swing, and that all gets fed into the drums element of this patch, which is the second big part. So effectively what we've got here is a beat grid, and these beat grids are mapped to MIDI voicings, which are sort of the standard. So if you go open up Logic, for example, and open one of the drum kits, the same MIDI notes are used here. So it should be quite universal amongst all DAWs and the drum kits that they have. So I've used this in Ableton as well and in Logic. The example I'm going to show you is in Logic. And I've got 2 banks of preset drum patterns which change every half bar. So effectively, if we look at this here, take the first bank, for example. This is the first preset. And if we go to, for example, the 17th preset, it changes slightly, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. So there's lots and lots of drum presets, and this Metro object and the random 46 will take one of these presets every half bar, and it will change the whole pattern. So effectively we have, I believe, 148,000 plus combinations that you can have for a drum pattern, which is quite a lot and very generative. And then this drum samples out patcher just tells us, shows us how the drums will be mapped onto MIDI notes. You can see here I've got a drum delay patcher, which is similar to the idea with the keys that, you know, not every note is going to be exactly on the beat. So yeah, for example, when a drummer's drumming, it's very hard to find a drummer that's exactly on time to the 0th millisecond. So these drum objects just sort of add a slight delay to that. Again, humanizing the whole feel of the drums. And again here, I haven't put it in a sub patcher yet, but these just tell us the velocity for the make notes. Again, like every note is not going to be the exact same when a drummer plays it in real life. So the drum object just sort of allows small fluctuations in that. And these plus objects here just keep that drum object within a certain range, so we're not fluctuating too much in velocity. So it's not completely random, but it sort of we've experimented with a lot of trial and error to get certain notes with different velocities. And these all are routed to port from Max 1, which will go straight to your DAW. For example, Logic and Ableton. I'll be using Logic. For the most part, that is the patch explained. And I'll just show you I'll just put the master up for that. I will now show you the patch in its full presentation mode. So this is what your end user will see. It could be a musician or producer. And I now have I've got a drum kit routed from Logic. So you've got the old school, just a standard drum kit, a little bit of room reverb there, just a drum chamber, and I've just lowered the EQ there just to make it nice. I'll show you what that sounds like now as a whole, and I'll show you the differences between the two harmonic languages of Alfa Mist and Kamal Williams. Hopefully this works. Just give me 1 second while I sort this out. Yeah, so hopefully that gave you a feel for my whole patch. And yeah, thanks for watching.